Alright, greetings everyone, and welcome to my new recording project, where we are going to be playing through a bunch of old games, and some of my favorite games of all time. Now, this is part one, which means I'm allowed to basically faff around and do whatever the hell I want, which is great, because I'm super excited to be doing that. So, apologies, but since I'm going to be uploading this at a pretty good pace, and the first video will come in with this part 2, which will be gameplay, as well as part 0, which is informing a little bit as to why I am doing this project. But essentially, part 1, I want to talk just a bit about my history with Final Fantasy to get it on record and get it out of my mind and into a place where it's a little bit more permanent. And then I'll also explain just about how these videos are going to be, and then we'll be able to get right along with it. So anyway, my history with Final Fantasy is actually about well, it's been a long time. My first Final Fantasy, I mean, we were a Nintendo family growing up. Before I was even born, my family just, had the Famicom NES system, the Super NES. And so when I finally got to an age where I could play games, it was very much like I had those systems growing up, and we already had a series of games, and I didn't really have too terribly much say. I mean, like, I remember renting video games and getting my parents to buy video games, but there was a lot of games that we already had before I started playing. And, my very first video game ever, it's been so long that I don't think I could even remember what it was, but it was probably the original Mario for the Nintendo Entertainment System, like many different people out there, and that's not really that special. But we had like all these different NES games. We had like the original Zelda and the gold cartridge, which was always special. We had Zelda 2, which was also really cool, and I could never really play that game. But among all those Nintendo games that we had the very first, the original, and the actual Final Fantasy, because everyone knows now that, like, that was Square's, like, last chance at making a successful video game. So that's why... Sorry, I knocked over it. Well done. So it was actually supposed to be the Final Fantasy. That's where the title comes from. And nowadays, people make fun of it. Oh, there are 20 games. How is it a Final Fantasy? But informed people understand the title. Anyway, and I hated the original Final Fantasy. I actually hated it as a kid, because back then when games were so simple, I had no understanding of armor systems and equipment, and needless to say, my first RPG was just really a bad experience, and it continued to be a bad experience for many years, because we never got any other real Final Fantasy games on like console. We always just had this original Final Fantasy that I kept going back to and playing. And like, as a kid, I mean, back then there was no internet, so you kind of just had to do what you were going to do, or like what you had is what you had. And there were, of course, Nintendo Power and all of that, but like, my family who played the original Zelda, they made like hand-drawn maps and everything, so I used those to get through the original Zelda game. But I had nothing, and I could never play the original Final Fantasy, and I never got very far in it. And like one time I remember I whipped armor, and it was such a revelation, but I never really continued playing the game too long after that. And we also had Game Boys. We had Game Boys growing up, and we had the Final Fantasy Legends, but it made no sense to me because it didn't seem anything like the Nintendo system, and I could never really grasp that idea of a Final Fantasy, what Final Fantasy was, because it only had 2 entry points. So skip ahead a bunch of years. We got like the N64 for Christmas one year with the Ocarina of Time, which is one of my favorite games ever. And like, I remember not knowing too much, but my one of my siblings had, an older sibling had a PlayStation, and the only other place I could play the PlayStation, because sister wouldn't let me anywhere near her PlayStation, was the, or maybe she lent it, but you know, I don't have really good, I don't remember that too well. I remember not having access to it, except going to my best friend's house who lived next door, and he had like Too Extreme, the sports playing game. He had Twisted Metal. He had a bunch of those, but like it wasn't until much later, about the time that the PlayStation 2 was coming out, that my parents offered me a deal. And they said, well, you can either wait a few months and get a brand new PlayStation 2, or we will buy you right now PlayStation 1, because there was like a PlayStation 1 for sale at like our local video rental store. And I was so interested as a teenager of having those new experiences that, and like a bloody fool, I chose the PlayStation 1 because, as we all know now, PS2 was just insane when it came out and could play all the PS1 games anyway. So, whoops, my bad. But then it was actually through my sister that she lent me like a couple of games to play and started getting me into a mood of wanting to try Final Fantasy again, because she loved Final Fantasy 8, and she had played through 7, and 9 I think was coming out very soon if it hadn't already come out already. And so my very first real introduction was not 7. I think I might have played a demo of 7 for a little bit of time, and I thought it was kind of cool. But 8 was actually my first real Final Fantasy that I sat down and played. And then after that, I went back and played 7, partially because I had heard from my sister that it was just 7's more difficult. You should play 8 first and do that, and then afterwards go back and play Final Fantasy 7. So I did, and I played through 8, and I still love 8 to this day. And then I played through 7, and 7 became one of my favorite games of all time. It really was just one of the most important games to me growing up, because, you know, living in a small town, growing up in a small town, not the most friendly person in the whole world. I played this game a lot, and I played through this game a ton. I'm not joking when I say I've lost count how many times I played this game, how many times I beat this game, and like I still love it to this day. And the remake project and rebirth project is something I'll have to make a different video about, because that's not really what this was. But I remember like being sick, staying home and just playing it all day in the Gold Saucer and all of that. And no matter how many other Final Fantasies I played, I always found a reason to come back to this almost every year and play through it again. And just how much the characters stuck with me, and still to this day kind of thing. So, and you know, from there it was onwards to 10. The funniest story I can tell about Final Fantasy 10, to essentially bookend this, because to me 10 was really kind of the end of that initial bit of Final Fantasy to me, where I failed as a kid to understand it, and as a teenager I fell in love with it. And then 10 was like Because there wasn't a really great way to play 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 back then. So like the DS and Game Boy Advance stuff kind of came out. But like Final Fantasy X, I remember getting my PS2 and not having a memory card. And we were actually went to our grandparents' house and we were babysitting, or we were looking after my cousin's house while they were gone somewhere. And I remember I got my PS2 and I got Final Fantasy X, and I learned that, oh yeah, you need a PS2 memory card. So playing through and keeping the PS2 on for days to try and preserve my save data from Final Fantasy X, and how much fun that was. But like that was some of the most important games of 7, 8, 9, and 10 too. But like to me, the PlayStation games still are absolutely golden in every way. I love playing through all three of them, and they are still in my top echelon of games ever. No excuses whatsoever. Make no excuses. But anyway, so that's kind of my history of Final Fantasy. It was just so important because whenever I felt down or bad or depressed because like a bad grade or something didn't go my way, I could always kind of count on it. And growing up with Nintendo, it probably, and just one of the reasons why I still even think so fondly of PlayStation, all of that. And heck, it's why I stick with some things that Square Enix does probably way longer after I should, like FFB, Votive, all of that stuff. Because nostalgia is a incredibly powerful thing. But I don't want this video to go on forever, so let me just talk a little bit about how this thing is going to go. So I'm going to be recording these roughly in 30-minute segments, or potentially a little bit longer, depending on how I'm vibing. This will have commentary because I want this to essentially be. This is not a let's play per se, and this is not a playthrough, and definitely not a no commentary playthrough. This is what I am calling a video game diary. And if you want to know more about why I'm doing it this way, it's because of preserving like memories and whatnot for myself into the future. And of course, entertainment for you. And if you vibe with, what's going on, feel free to share in the comments section, because that's really cool. So, without too much further ado, without making this transition too much more awkward, I want to say that I hope you enjoy these videos. I hope I do a good job of them, and I'll just be talking throughout them, commenting on stuff, and of course, like, reminiscing about things that I did, both embarrassing and not embarrassing, throughout this video playthrough. So yeah, thanks so much for listening to my spiel. And again, if you want a little bit more information on why the project is the way it is, please check out part 0. It'll also be uploaded at the exact same time. Anyway, so we'll cut the video here, come back, and we'll start playing.